Thus far in our study, we have looked at two examples of conflict. One, the first, was the conflict between the great leader Augustine of Hippo and Pelagius over the effectiveness of the human will. Remember that Pelagius taught that the fall of Adam affected only Adam, and that people come into the world neutral, neither good nor bad. They can go either way depending upon their free choice. And therefore, their salvation is left in their hands, and if they do good, they will be saved. If they do evil, they will not. Augustine countered that by saying, we are saved by grace. The will of man is fallen, and grace is necessary. God must work in our hearts to change our hearts and bring about salvation. So it was clearly a matter of grace versus works, clearly a matter of the will being freed from sin by a decree of God with Augustine, whereas with Pelagius it was always free and subject to man's decisions. In our next study, we looked at the conflict that took place in the 11th and 12th century between Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter Abelard. And really it was over the same thing. When it came down to it, Abelard was saying, my will is totally autonomous. I will decide what I'm going to believe. I will look at the evidence and I will create my faith based on my decision after I have investigated the evidence. Whereas Bernard said, no, then if that's the case, your faith rests upon your opinion of what is right and wrong. And that opinion is not a substantial base. Rather, he said, Holy Scripture says that faith itself is the base. Faith itself is the substructure, the hypostasis, upon which everything rests. So it was a variation of the same conflict. Now, Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, attempted to work out a harmony of that, a synthesis, bring those two viewpoints together and try to reconcile the divergent views. And thus we have what is known as Thomistic theology, or the decision of the scholastics, the schoolmen. But as time went on, there were those who objected to what Thomas Aquinas did. Thomas Aquinas basically said, I want to reach the decision, the conclusions of Augustine, but I want to use the method of Aristotle, the method of reason and dialectic, of observation by sense perception. I'm using this method that Abelard used to reach the conclusion of Augustine. But Thomas Aquinas' work was a very delicate balance. Many people call it a theological house of cards. And it took a lot of willingness to support that house of cards for it to stand. And it was very tedious, and it was very complicated. And people really wanted a much more simple faith and a much more personal faith, because Thomas Aquinas came up with a theology that was about as warm as a dead fish. It had no feeling to it. It was intellectual, but it was not warm, and it was not personal, and it was very complicated. And so there was a reaction against Thomas Aquinas. And there were those who never accepted him. As a matter of fact, he really wasn't fully embraced by the Roman Church until the Council of Trent, which is after the Reformation. So there were always those who disagreed with him. As a matter of fact, some of his strongest critics came after his time, such as Duns Scotus, who believed with all his heart in the sovereignty of God. And so when we come into the 14th century, which was a very strange century, where things seemed to go awry, when the whole world seemed to collapse, when the papacy was taken captive to Avignon, France, when the Black Death struck, when France and England engaged in a series of wars that lasted over 100 years, when peasants rose up in insurrection against their lords, was a disastrous century. And in this century, one thing is very certain as far as religion's concerned: people became dissatisfied with the Roman Church and with its very complicated, very cold theology. And we're looking for something that was more meaningful, more relevant, more personal, something simpler. Now, they will go off in all directions. One direction that they will go is the direction of what we call humanism. We want to talk a little bit about humanism and how it came to eventually be a possible solution for the complexity and for the lack of personal warmth in the Thomistic system. You see, humanism, in one sense, began in the Garden of Eden, when Eve thought she would become like God. But humanism was developed among the Greeks. Protagoras of Abdera said man is the measure of all things. And the focus in the Greek civilization was upon man. Humanism was rediscovered during the Renaissance in Italy, which begins around 1300. And the reason that it began in Italy is the fact that Italy was somewhat isolated from the medieval civilization. Italy had never really fully participated in the medieval world, because the medieval world was based on an economy that was determined by large manors, farms, agriculture, that led to the feudal system. And because they couldn't have these large manors in Italy, the topography, the hills and all are not conducive to that, Italy was somewhat out of the mainstream of events during the Middle Ages. But Italy came alive when the great trading empires began to decline. And I speak of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic Empire. They began to decline by 1200. And as they declined and went through a long process of death, resulted when eventually the Ottomans took over the Islamic Empire, and resulted when the Byzantine Empire was also taken over by the Ottomans and totally destroyed, the Italians began to buy up the trade routes, began to operate the trade routes. And these Italian cities really came alive because people became quite wealthy. Florence, Pisa, Genoa, Venice, Naples, Milan. They became very wealthy. Siena, many others. And in these various Italian city-states, they didn't have a nobility, a king, and all. They had basically businessmen ruling. We call them merchant princes. It was more democratic than the monarchies of Europe. And as the trade continued and as they accumulated wealth, they came in contact with manuscripts and with artworks that were kept in the Byzantine lands and the Islamic lands, and it really opened up first through the Crusades. And these works of art and these manuscripts began to be filtered through trade into Italy. And then they recognized, why, these are artifacts, these are manuscripts of our ancestors, the Romans, that found their way to the east when the Roman capital was moved, the Roman Empire's capital moved in 330 to Constantinople. And so now they were really excited, and Italy came alive with an interest in their heritage, which was the Roman Empire. Eventually, that expanded to include the Greeks, when a Greek scholar came to Florence in 1396. And as they developed this passion for the ancient world, for the classics, they will seek to learn from it, to use it. And it's a phenomenon particularly of the upper class, of the wealthy people, of course. But they began to develop the idea of trying to let the past communicate values to them, teach them. The church hasn't taught us everything we need to know. The Romans knew how to live, how to enjoy life. So did the Greeks. There are great lessons that will help us live more productive lives, that will help us in our cities and our civic life. We can learn valuable lessons. We need to communicate with them. And so the Renaissance began with the idea of communicating with the past. What will Cicero tell us? What can Plutarch tell us? What can Caesar tell us? What can Plato or Aristotle or Herodotus or Thucydides or any of these great thinkers or writers from the past, what can they tell us that will be valuable? And so in this secular climate in Italy that wasn't as religious as the North, in the midst of the wealth of Italy from the trade, there grew up this passion for the classics. And as it defined itself, it was a culture then that, like the ancient world, was centered on man. It was humanistic. Man became the center of this universe. That was best articulated by an Italian by the name of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a prince, in his oration on the dignity of man, where he puts man center stage. Individualism. Man is important. The individual is important. And then came the idea, as they began to further experiment with the classical past, if we learn enough, we can reach perfection. We can reach a moral perfection through knowledge. And of course, then you begin to think back and say, well, man's problem is not really sin, it's ignorance. And if he just learns enough, he will correct the problem and he'll be all right. And so, in that kind of a view where man is not viewed as a sinner, but as simply someone who is ignorant, who can stand to benefit from the lessons of the past, then hell and the wrath of God are irrelevant. God is not seen from the standpoint of one who can dispense wrath or blessing, but he is seen as the perfect man. And we can reach that by our knowledge. Understand that humanism and moralism as a goal go hand in hand. Humanists always tend to have moralism or morality as their goal, as the supreme good. The leaders of this, men like Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, who was passionate in searching for manuscripts and finding the original manuscripts because they wanted to know, what did the original say? What did Cicero really write? What did Homer really say? We don't want commentaries or texts that have been added to and changed through the years and allegorized. We want to know what they really said. We want to go back to the fountain, back to the source, and learn from that. Giovanni Boccaccio, who wrote the Decameron, a very realistic story, not at all dressed up and allegorized and idealized, but just revealing society as he knew it, and began to develop tools of research. Marsilio Ficino, who translated the entire works of Plato, and also of Hermes Trismegistus, who even deals in a Platonic fashion with magic. Because now, you see, man seeks to manipulate and control and reach this perfection even through the use and device of magic. There's some vehicle to do that. Pico himself, who not only wrote and delivered the Oration on the Dignity of Man, but Pico, who was a great Hebrew and Greek scholar. Castiglione, who wrote a book called The Courtier, setting forth the ideal behavior and manners. And when the Renaissance spoke of morals, they were talking about etiquette as well, and how you behave yourself in public, and how you conduct yourself in a social way. Niccolo Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince, a book which is a practical guide to politics. His concept of morality was order in the state. And however a prince maintains order and control, let him do it, regardless of the means that he uses. Now, out of this matrix of the Renaissance grew these ideas that we call Renaissance humanism. And for a long time, they will remain south of the Alps in Italy and will not penetrate north. Let's leave them there for just a moment and journey north of the Alps. And I mean by that France and Germany and the Low Countries and England and even Spain, Burgundy. And there we see there's a distinctly different atmosphere. The North had always been more Christian. That seems strange when Rome was the home of the papacy. But the North was always more devout. Now, in the North, there was strong resentment to the papacy, discouragement with the Thomistic synthesis. In the North, there was this search for a more spiritual life, a more personal, pious religion. And there developed in the North a concept that is called the devotio moderna, which means, of course, the modern devotion. And it was a very warm, very personal way of looking at things. Now, those people who espoused the devotio moderna were not breaking with the Roman Church, but they were seeking to use some of the freedom that Rome allowed to her members at this time to explore new ways of being spiritual. And one of the ways that they will do this is by imitating Christ, following Christ. And this is particularly true of a subset of the devotio moderna, which we'll call the mystics. Now let me give you a working definition of mysticism that applies in any circumstance. Bernard of Clairvaux was a mystic. Ignatius Loyola was a mystic. Plato was a mystic. Teresa, St. Teresa, not the recent one, but the one in the past in Spain, of Avila, was a mystic. There are mystics who were good, loyal Roman Catholics. But a mystic is one who seeks a personal and spiritual union with God. And he seeks to achieve that by some means, some method. Now, sometimes it's meditation and prayer. Sometimes it's good works. Maybe a number of things. But one of the media that was used to achieve this mystical union of your soul with God was by imitating the life of Jesus Christ our Lord. The imitation of Christ. And you find Thomas à Kempis writing a book that you can go buy in the bookstore today. There's still a popular book called On the Imitation of Christ. It's a very mystical book. Follow Christ. You find a man like Meister Eckhart, who was the great preacher that delivered these beautiful sermons on following Christ, being Christ-like, letting your light shine, taking up your cross, serving the Lord. You have it today somewhat in this concept of what would Jesus do? What would the Lord do in this circumstance? Now do this. Do you know the church brought 26 counts of heresy against Meister Eckhart? Now they dismissed them. And if you read the sermons of Meister Eckhart, and you can get them and you can read them, you will say, why did they bring 26 charges of heresy against the man? And then why did they drop them? When I was doing my doctoral work, my professor assigned me to read the works of Meister Eckhart and write a paper. And so I wrote a paper, and I said, there is nothing heretical in these sermons. And he wrote me a note on my paper and gave it back and said, Mr. Lawrence, you missed the point. You don't know the difference between explicit and implicit heresy. Now, they dropped the charges because it was implicit. But it was implicit, and that's why, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. You see, if I say to you, you follow Jesus, and you will find a unity with Jesus. You will find a communion with Jesus. Nothing wrong with that. But what did the Roman Church usually mean by communion? Sacraments. The Eucharist. The Lord's Supper. One of the 7 sacraments, because they taught that grace comes to the 7 sacraments, and the priest administers the 7 sacraments. And you see, if you read the sermons of Meister Eckhart, he never talks about the sacraments. He never talks about the church. He never denounces the church, but he never mentions the church. He ignores it. And he just simply says, you follow Jesus, you have a communion with him. Church thought, something's wrong here. But we don't know what. He doesn't say that we're wrong. He doesn't condemn us. He's faithful to the Pope. And yet, you see, he was saying, you can have this communion. That was the mystics. And there was more than Meister Eckhart. There was John Tauler, whom Luther read. Suso, the Friends of God. There was a whole group of them. There was a man named Gerhard Groote in the Low Countries. His way to God was through service. He founded a lay order. They didn't take the vows like monks. They were a lay order called the Brethren of the Common Life. Isn't that beautiful? Brethren of the Common Life. And they would take in orphans, and they would operate dormitories for students, and they would provide tutorial services for students. Isn't that wonderful? When you want to get your lessons, you can go study with one of the brethren, and he will help you with your lessons, your homework. They did good works, and they were mystics. Now, bear in mind the Devotio Moderna in the north and the Renaissance humanism in Italy. Now, it's bound to be that sooner or later the Renaissance will cross the Alps. And after the North recovered from the 100 Years' War and the Black Death and all the other problems they had, we begin to see banks being established in the North. And that was feeding money into the economy. And they were not so agriculturally based. And actually the towns had grown up in the 12th century, but they had been hurt by these events. But now they begin to recover. And there was more capitalism. And so with trade, came money. And they began to trade with people in Italy. And as they traded along those trade routes through the Alps came the ideas of the Renaissance. And the wealthy people of the North now began to get interested in the Italian Renaissance. And wealthy men of the North would send their sons to Italy to study, to make the Italian trip. And Italian young men, where the job market was saturated, there were no jobs available because there were so many scholars, not enough jobs now to fill them. Now they would come north where the jobs were. And they could come north and they could be court poets and secretaries to nobles. And they could be teachers. And all these jobs were open for educated young men from Italy. And so you see the ideas are really flowing now. And of course those young men from the north who went to Italy to study would come back with all these Italianate ideas, they were called. Renaissance ideas, humanistic ideas. And as the ideas of the Renaissance hit the north, which was decidedly more Christian, they were changed, they were modified by that Christian atmosphere in the north. And the pagan, secular thrust of the Italian Renaissance was subdued and was made much more Christian. And so now we have this interesting term that seems like a contradiction, Christian humanism, developing in the north. And the concept of Christian humanism that merged with the Devotio Moderna is to be more pious, more committed to Christianity, but it will retain the emphasis on man. Man is still center. Man is still perfectible through knowledge. It retains the emphasis on the original sources, but now the original sources become the Bible and the writings of the fathers. Now, the Italians had not yet looked to the Bible, maybe because they weren't interested in the Bible. They had produced critical editions of all the works of the Greeks and Romans, but not of the Bible or of the fathers. It was the work that was next to be done. But there was more interest in it in the north. Like the Italian Renaissance, morality was the goal, but now it's distinctly Christian morality, and it is achieved through the study of the Bible. Individualism is important. Man is essentially good. Ignorance is the problem. God is far away and distant from man. But it is a Christian reform movement. It really is a Christian reform movement. They became very concerned about the immorality and the corruption in the Roman Church. And it is these people who are the most severe critics of corruption in the church. Most severe. To give you an example of some of the people that are involved in this movement, there was a man at Paris by the name of Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples. This man, professor at the University of Paris, will do something that was not done before. He will take the Bible and he will, in fact, lecture from Scripture. Now, that had not been done before. Lectures on theology were given, but they were based on the texts of the great scholars. But to take the Bible into a classroom and say, students, let us open to the book of Galatians, or let us open to the book of Genesis, let us study this text, was unheard of. And he wasn't a cleric. He was a scholar. But he was going back to the original sources so that the students could learn from the Bible itself the great lessons of God that would make their lives more Christ-like. And John Colet did the same thing at Oxford University in England. And John Colet, also, whose father was a doctor and his father passed away and had left him a large inheritance, took that money and established St. Paul's School for Boys, which I understand is still operating in London, to teach these principles, to teach the Bible to people. Johann Reuchlin in Cologne, Germany, was a great Hebrew scholar, taught the Old Testament, and actually got into trouble with the church over that. Can you imagine getting into trouble with the church for teaching Hebrew? But you see, there was a Jew by the name of Pfefferkorn, who was converted from Judaism to Christianity and wrote this ridiculous tract condemning the study of Hebrew as being subversive to a Christian's faith and causing them to take up Judaism. And Reuchlin defended himself by writing a tract called Letters of Eminent Men, where he took examples of people who had achieved great success in life, who'd studied Hebrew and had not abandoned their Christian faith. But even that was not enough. Reuchlin was hauled before the Inquisition in Cologne, Germany. But he had a friend who published a little satirical book anonymously. His name was Ulrich von Hutten. And von Hutten wrote the Letters of Obscure Men. Now, these were all made up. Reuchlin's were real cases. But his were made up. But they were funny. And they made the church look ridiculous. Now, you know that there are certain occupations in society that we consider to be the most degrading occupations of all. I'm not going to name them because I realize that many people pursue those professions honorably. But there are occupations that are down at the very bottom. Think of the worst thing you could do for a living. And also bums and people that are idle and don't do anything at all. And all these people are giving testimonies and saying, "Thank you, Mother Church. Thank you, for you have made us all we are today. We would not be who we are, where we are today, had the church not kept us in blissful ignorance. Had you let us study, we might not be who we are today." And of course it made the church appear to be the champion of total ignorance, and they had to drop the charges, but the battle wasn't over. And you see, these Christian humanists were the most forceful in their criticism of the corruption of the Roman Church. Thomas More, who the play A Man for All Seasons is written about his life, who wrote the Utopia at his home in Chelsea, gathered humanist scholars to be committed to biblical scholarship, to studying the Bible. And among them was Prince Hal, who later became Henry VIII. And among them, of course, was John Colet and many, many others. And later, even the man we're going to be talking about, Erasmus. There was Cardinal Jimenez in Spain, a cardinal in the church, who established the University of Alcala, who wanted to reform the church along humanistic lines, that is, through knowledge of Scripture, who himself came to believe and affirm the doctrine of justification by faith alone. So also did Gasparo Contarini, who headed up a commission to look into abuses under Paul III. And the greatest Christian humanist, the Prince of Humanists, is going to be the focus of our study, and that's Erasmus of Rotterdam. One final comment before we stop tonight, and that is this whole process in the North, which includes the Northern Renaissance and the Reformation to follow, were greatly benefited by an invention that made the distribution of books available in accurate form, in greater quantity, and at much less cost than ever before. And that is what Mr. Gutenberg contributed in the middle of the 15th century, the printing press.